It is a great honor to welcome once again to this program Matthew Continetti of the American Enterprise Institute. This is his third appearance on this show. The last one was actually a year ago, almost exactly a year ago. We are going to discuss the great political thinker Irving Kristol. But first, welcome Matt to the show once again.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
Okay. So I'd like to start with a bit of news. You've probably heard of the hostage rescue conducted by Israel this past weekend. It is a piece of good news, but it also revealed some pretty disturbing facts. One is that the hostages were held by Palestinian civilians, so not members of Hamas. One of them, I believe, was an Al Jazeera journalist. And secondly, the fact that Israel had rescued these hostages received condemnations from what can be called the international community, as signified by the International Criminal Court warrant against Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and all the other Hamas members. So, your thoughts on that?
Well, my first thought was how wonderful it was that the IDF forces were able to rescue the 4 hostages. It was so wonderful to wake up last Saturday. We're recording this on Friday, June 14th, to the good news that 4 hostages had been rescued. And it had been some while, I think, that supporters of Israel had woken up to such good news. I think it's important to recognize that these hostages were rescued, not released. Hamas has not released any hostages since last November, and despite there now being 5 different subsequent ceasefire proposals forwarded by the United States, Hamas has rejected them all. It looks like Hamas is going to also reject the current one under consideration, again forwarded by the Biden administration. The hostages need to be released, and what release requires is military force. Second, I was disturbed, as you suggest, by the fact that these hostages were being held in private homes by Palestinians. And I think it complicates this notion, again advanced by the Biden administration, that we were to somehow distinguish between Hamas and the Palestinian populace. Obviously, non-combatants need to be protected to the extent possible in a time of war. But when you consider the circumstances of the captivity, when you look at public opinion polls that say 2/3 of Gazans, majorities in the West Bank, support Hamas and support October 7th, it makes one wonder why the administration, the Biden administration, is so interested in creating a Palestinian state. There seems to me to be no plausible reason that Israel should agree to a Palestinian state until the Palestinians recognize that Israel is here to stay and that violence is wrong. So I have many reactions to the event of the hostage rescue, but the first one was cheer that these 4 hostages were rescued, but also alarm that the American administration in particular does not recognize the evil of Hamas and the difficulty in essentially de-radicalizing the Palestinian population. Finally, I would say, as you also suggested, Chong, the international reaction was disturbing. The fact that at the same day as the hostage rescue here in Washington, D.C., a group of Hamas sympathizers conducted a violent protest in Lafayette Square, just across the street from the White House, was very disturbing for people like me who believe that America is a Jewish home. It's not Israel. It's not the national home of the Jewish people, but America throughout our history has been a refuge for Jews and has protected Jews. And we see since October 7th that Jews have been threatened in America. And we continue to see that. And the threats and the harassment and the incitement seems to grow louder whenever Israel defends itself. And that, I think, was also disturbing.
Yeah, we corresponded sometime a few weeks ago, I think, on what happened in your alma mater, Columbia University. And I drew a bunch of comparisons between the protests that were going on now versus the one in 1968. They were protesting a variety of causes, but the war in my home country, Vietnam, was one of them. And I do wonder, in your view, of all the conflicts that were going on, even back in 68 as well as in 2024, why is this one, the one between Israel and Hamas or Gaza or the Palestinians, receive disproportionate, so to speak, attention from college-age people?
Well, I think the answer is simple, but also very alarming, and that is there has been a decades-long effort to turn campuses into the vanguard of the war to delegitimize and eventually destroy Israel as a Jewish state. This has been going on for some time. The sources of this vile ideology stem from the so-called post-colonial studies, postmodern theorists who view everything through the oppressor-oppressed framework. That type of scholarship, advanced by the literary critic Edward Said, has colonized, if you will, humanities departments throughout the academy in the United States, but more specifically, Middle Eastern studies departments, where the faculty are overwhelmingly anti-Israel and often anti-Semitic. Another source for this corruption has been foreign governments. Governments in the Middle East, Arab governments who are hostile to the state of Israel, want to see it delegitimized in academic circles and among the broader youth, have funded Middle Eastern studies in the United States and faculty positions, putting their people, so to speak, in place. So that's the institutional component. I think it's been going on for decades, and it's sad and disgusting to see. There are a couple other things at work. One is there are many more international students in the United States today, certainly than there were in 1968. And many of these international students are citizens, residents of countries who wish to see Israel off the map. And so I believe many of the students involved in these protests are international students. But we've also seen that many of the people involved in the protests and in the pro-Hamas encampments aren't actually students at all. They're part of this broader left that is against Israel, that is against America, and that latches on to cause, from cause to cause, depending on where the attention is. So 4 years ago, it would have been the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, it's the pro-Hamas movement. And another component is the social media culture where we live. It's the air so many young people breathe in. And it has also been saturated with anti-Israel, anti-Semitic tropes. The binary through which so many people around the world see Israel, this idea of colonizer, colonized, where Israel is the colonizer somehow, oppressor, oppressed, where Israel is the oppressor somehow, is very widespread, and it's propagated through social media. And this is where I think the roots of the campus protests lie. Combination of the ideologies at work on the campus, intersectionality, and settler colonialism, this idea that somehow all societies that were settled are illegitimate, including America, it should be said. And then social media, which allows these messages to go viral and to embed themselves in young people's consciences in particular.
Okay. Yeah. One should also mention that Edward Said also found a home in Columbia University. So he was there for it.
That's right. Yes, I saw him there when I was a student.
So finally, before we move on to Kristol, I think you don't have to convince me on this because I already agree with you. But why do you characterize the protesters as pro-Hamas rather than pro-Palestine?
Well, it's pretty easy to make that characterization when so many of the protests, especially more recently, are openly pro-Hamas, openly pro-October 7th. You have protests going on in the United States where the protesters scream death to America. We also see throughout, back since November, when the Houthi militia in Yemen began essentially shutting down global sea lanes across the Red Sea, many of these protests are pro-Houthi. The useful idiots, if not fellow travelers, who are behind these protests seem to have views that are pretty well aligned with the views of the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. It's the principal engine of the war against Israel, the multi-front war against Israel, whether we're talking about Gaza in the south, we're talking about the border with Lebanon, where Hezbollah has been raining rockets on the Iranian civilian population for months, whether we're talking about the Syrian or Iraqi militias, we're talking about the Houthis, or whether we're talking about Iran itself launching the first direct attack against Israel in its history in April. This is a very difficult time to be a Jew or to be an Israeli, and it's very important for the United States to be absolutely clear in its support for the state of Israel as it faces its threats, because as the protests make so clear when they deface the statue of the Marquis de Lafayette, when they deface symbols of American pride and history, and they try to take down the American flag and replace it with the Hamas, the Palestinian flag. Israel's enemies are America's enemies.
Now, that brings me to one of Kristol's essays, which he authored or published in 1991. It was in Commentary. It was called The Future of American Jewry. And I'd like to quote from his piece. The American Jewish community today, I guess by that he means 1991, is comfortable, secure, but lacking in self-confidence. It shows frequent symptoms of hypochondria and neurasthenia. It is a community very vulnerable to its own repressed anxieties and self-doubts. So I wonder, in the wake of October the 7th and to the present, to what extent is Kristol's assessment rings true?
Well, I think it's important to recognize the context in which this particular essay was written. In 1991, America was in the midst of a large debate over the religious right, the evangelical Christians, their rise in American politics. And American Jews, who are predominantly, almost overwhelmingly liberal Democrats in terms of their political ideology and partisan affiliation, were very much alarmed at the rise of the religious right. And so this essay, The Future of American Jewry, is a response to that alarm. And Kristol makes the point that the American Jewish community at this time had a kind of a false conception of what America was, and they needed to be more realistic about politics in the world, which was a more general theme of Irving Kristol's work, and understand that their real enemy was not the religious right, but it was this kind of ideology of secular humanism, as he identified it. I think the issues have changed. The American Jewish community has changed in the 30 years since this essay was published. And I'll give you an example. One change has been the rise of the modern Orthodox population in the United States within the American Jewish community. And then there's been a concomitant rise in what are called Haredim in Israel, but Hasidim in the United States. Capital O Orthodox Jews who subscribe to certain schools of thought stretching back to the Pale of Settlement in the 19th century. The American Jewish community is, in my view, more religious today than it was 30 years ago. And if you were talking about religious Jews in the United States, and if you're talking about Jews for whom Israel is the defining issue, they are not secular liberals. In fact, they're more likely to be conservative Republicans. So the character of the American Jewish community has somewhat changed. What we have today is millions of American Jews identify as Jewish. They have no substantive attachment to Jewish peoplehood, Jewish communal life, Jewish religious life. But because of their heritage, they say that they're American Jews. Of course, that's their right. But it makes it difficult to ascertain the actual political character of the American Jewish community. So I think the essay is worth reading, as all of Irving Kristol's are. But I would also say that if you were to write about the future of American Jewry today, it would look much different. I think one category that has been very apparent since October 7th is what my friend Eli Lake calls the as-a-Jews. The American Jews who begin every sentence with "as a Jew," comma, and usually end the sentence by saying something derogatory of Israel or the Zionist enterprise or Jewish religious life, certainly Jewish Orthodox life. That is a group that is not really present in the future of American Jewry that Kristol wrote about 30 years ago, but would have to be discussed in an essay written today, just as the religiosity of American Jewry needs to be addressed in an essay written today.
Yeah, I read Eli's piece on that, and it's a wonderful piece. Yeah, it has a lengthy treatment of the Christian anti-Semitic debate between like two theologians back in the 15th century who were German. And yeah, I recommend anyone who's listening to read that. Yeah, Kristol did end that essay with quote, "American Jews alert to Christian anti-Semitism are in danger of forgetting that it was the pagans, the Babylonians and the Romans, who destroyed the temples and twice imposed exile on the Jewish people," end quote. I think nowadays, worries about Christian-based or right-wing anti-Semitism seems to have taken a back seat over, I guess, left-wing secular or Arabic/Islamic anti-Semitism.
I think it depends on who you're talking to.
Okay.
So for the as-a-Jews, for example, they would tend to highlight right-wing anti-Semitism, which is still out there, which is a challenge to the American Jewish community. The attack on the synagogue in Pittsburgh, the Tree of Life Synagogue in 2018, that was from a right-wing extremist. So that cannot be dismissed. And there is kind of the soft bigotry that you see in some corners of the American right. Even the idea of the Jews as Christ killers, for example, has kind of bubbled up in debates over potential legislative ways of addressing the turmoil and anti-Semitism on American campuses. However, I do think that the greatest threat to American Jews today comes from a left that has essentially adopted the Hamas point of view. It's certainly the greatest threat to the Jewish people. Without Israel, the future for the Jewish people becomes very, very muddled. The future of the Jewish people depends on the future of the state of Israel. If you want to destroy Israel as a Jewish state, you are violating the potential for continuity among the Jewish people as a whole. That's the point that Charles Krauthammer, the late columnist and essayist, made in a 1998 essay, which I always recommend, and which I think holds true today. So Jews unfortunately face many threats, and I think the reason for that is the West is weak. Western civilization is weak. When liberal democracy was strong coming out of World War II, when it had a sense of purpose, it had just had a recent victory, America, Western European states were safe for Jews. Since the end of the Cold War, though, I think the West and America, they've been weakened. They've lost their sense of purpose as societies. American society is very weak. Our economy is good, minus inflation, of course. But our society is weak. And as a result, the Jewish people have become endangered too. So this is something that Irving, Kristol, and his contemporary Norman Podhoretz always understood, that somehow the fate of the Jewish people is tied to the fate of liberal democracy. And if liberal democracy is eroding, Jews will become endangered. And they had different and often similar takes on how to invigorate and strengthen liberal democracy. But that was the essential point. And I think today you see the forces of the radical left undermining liberal democracy, undermining the West, undermining the core social institutions of the West. And that, I think, is a threat to the Jewish people, just as, of course, Islamic terrorism, in whether it comes from Hamas, whether it comes from ISIS, whether it comes from Iran, is a deadly and pressing threat.
So
I think I have just one more point. I think organization is the key metric here. So the right-wing anti-Semitism is not organized. It's not institutionalized. It's these awful, evil lone wolves, typically, who go on chat boards and are radicalized and then eventually explode in a violent way, taking others with them. The left anti-Semitism is institutionalized, whether we're talking about the universities, whether we're talking about the divisions within the Democratic Party over Israel, or whether we're talking about the actual organized violence against the Jews in Israel and around the world that is propagated by Hamas and its masters in Iran.
Yes. So outside of the pages of commentary or tablet magazine, to what extent are American Jews willing to stand up for Israel?
Oh, well, I think to quite an extent, actually. I mean, taking away from the intellectual world, where you mentioned a few publications there, but even in Jewish communal publications, there is widespread support for Israel. You see the march for Israel last year brought out many, many people. You see the way in which the pro-Israel community, which encompasses many American Jews, has involved itself in politics in some of these key primary debates. Party selection of candidates been very important, and there the AIPAC has been extremely important. That's trying to find candidates in both parties who are supportive of the U.S.-Israel relationship and who understand why Israel matters. And you also see many Jewish professors or intellectuals who, or just normal citizens who were kind of mugged by reality on October 7th and by what has happened afterwards. And so I think it's to great extent that the American Jewish community has been activated in defense of Israel since October 7th. Now, again, I always like to say, I think this is a comment from Milton Himmelfarb, the great scholar of American Judaism or Judaism in general, who was related to Irving Kristol through marriage. But at some point, Himmelfarb said, Jews are just like everyone else, except more so. So, like every community, American Jews have arguments, and more arguments than most communities. And so there is clearly, as I say, this as a Jew group that tend to be surrounded by, around the Jewish Currents magazine, the literary scene in New York, far left politics, followers of Peter Beinart's Twitter feed. They're there. They are continuing to be critical of Israel. But I don't think they represent the majority of American Jewish opinion.
I wonder, does having a positive outlook on the American project influence a given American Jews' support for Israel?
I mean, I don't know the data. I would say that they are tied. And I would think it would work in the negative. So I would just say, I think you'd be more likely to find among anyone, doesn't matter whether they're Jew or Gentile, if you're against Israel, you're probably against America and its political institutions. And unfortunately, we see that among young people in the United States, there's a rise in hostility toward Israel, sympathy for Hamas, and also a hostility toward the United States and its future. This is a major problem for America, to have a rising generation that is so critical, so willing to repudiate its inheritance. And that's a major challenge for all of us who want America to succeed in the coming years.
So, in Kristol's opinion, how does an American Jew find his or her place within America, which is broadly a Christian country?
Well, I think Irving Kristol was comfortable with his place as an American Jew in a broadly Christian country. I think he would say you have to recognize that it's a Christian country. He had no illusions that it was something else, and he thought that the fact that it was a Christian country was a good thing, because it meant that religious attitudes and religious values suffused the country. Primarily, these were Protestant, because the majority of the settlers of America came from the Protestant country of England. And he thought that was a good thing. He thought that the American political tradition kind of came out of its English Protestantism. And he thought that religious sensibility created the social, cultural, political structure that allowed American Jews to flourish. So he thought that American Jews should be comfortable in the United States, had done great things in the United States, and should be grateful for the United States, but should also not pretend that the United States was anything that it wasn't.
I wonder, has Kristol ever used the phrase Judeo-Christian morals or culture or ethos? Or if not, how would he define it?
I don't know the answer to that. Um, I wouldn't be surprised if he used it once or twice. The Judeo-Christian hybrid, that compound word, a term, comes out of, I think, the post-war era, a sense that America needed to find a common language of public religion that included the American Jewish community along with the Christian majority. And that Christian majority was Protestant and Catholic. So the theologian Will Herberg wrote a very famous book in the 1950s called Protestant Catholic Jew, where he was kind of saying this is the basis of America's culture of religion in public life. And so I think that Irving Kristol largely agreed with that idea, especially with the idea that religion is important in public life. And so he may have used the phrase in his many writings. You know, one thing that people don't recognize, I think, fully about Irving Kristol is that there are only 5 extant collections of his work. And I believe only 2 of those are actually still in print. But he was a very prolific writer. And so if you go to the website contemporarythinkers.org, you will be able to find a complete bibliography of all of his writings, as well as those of many other contemporary thinkers people should pay attention to. And I encourage your listeners to do that. So somewhere in all of that writing, he was, after all, a journalist. People, looking back, thinking about Irving Kristol, they call him a social philosopher. They call him a scholar of politics. He was a journalist. That's really what he did. He held no advanced degrees. He was an intellectual journalist, and so he wrote quite a bit. And I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere in all of those words he used the phrase Judeo-Christian.
Yeah. So of the 5 collections that you've mentioned, I happen to have 2 of them. So this one is the first, the Autobiography of an Idea, Neoconservatism, and the other is the Neoconservative Persuasion. I think it was
that's right. Those are the 2 that are in print, I believe, still.
Yeah. Okay. So how would you reflect on Kristol's use of journalism as a medium or vehicle for his ideas?
Well, it was the medium. And it was print journalism. He avoided television. There really only one sustained television interview with Irving Kristol. You can find it on the website of C-SPAN, the public affairs cable network, cspan.org. And there, if you search for Irving Kristol, you'll find about an hour-long interview he held in conjunction of the publication of Neoconservatism, the Autobiography of an Idea, in 1995. But he hated TV. So if you didn't see him in a classroom, he taught at the NYU Business School for almost 2 decades, or if you didn't see him on a panel, he often appeared on public panels at various think tanks, including the American Enterprise Institute, where I work, where he was also associated for many years. Really, it was through his writings that you would encounter him. Just to take a step back, Kristol came out of the community of this so-called New York intellectuals. These were young men and women, mainly men, in the 1930s and 40s who were heavily interested, deeply interested in politics. And I mean high politics, the politics of grand ideologies like Marxism and liberalism and fascism, as well as culture and ideas. And they wrote for little magazines, including Commentary Magazine, which was founded in 1945. And they reflected deeply on the core texts of the Western tradition, on the battles of ideology, on the state of America, in the world. And many of them, beginning in the 50s, began to become much more prominent and write for more mainstream publications. Kristol began founding publications around this time, but he really reached a mass audience in 1972 when he became a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. So he wrote a monthly column for the Wall Street Journal between 1972 and basically 1992. Then it kind of trailed off and was more intermittent. And so that was really his platform. That's where he brought the sensibility of a New York intellectual, someone who had grown up in a culture where big ideas mattered, where polemics were extremely well wrought and heated. And he took that sensibility and applied it to current events through his Wall Street Journal column. So that's how I would say journalism really counted. He helped co-found an organization to sponsor the careers of young journalists. And through his founding of publications, of course, whether it's Encounter magazine or The Public Interest, and later he was the publisher of a magazine called The National Interest, he helped further the careers of young journalists as well. So yes, journalism was essential.
Mhm. Yes. Speaking about the AEI, tell me about the prize named after him, the Irving Kristol Prize.
Sure. Well, AEI has sponsored an annual lecture for many years and often given an award to accompany that lecture. After Irving Kristol's death in 2009, that lecture was changed, the title of the lecture, to the Irving Kristol Award and Lecture. A way to honor him, because he had been associated with AEI since the late 1970s. And when he and his wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, moved to Washington, D.C. from New York City in 1986-87, he became a regular presence at AEI, really up until toward the end of his life. So for about another 15 years or so, he was here at AEI pretty regularly. It was funny, the Public Interest magazine, which he founded in 1965 and which came out 4 times a year, when he moved to DC, the Public Interest moved with him. And so they had offices just about a block away from AEI's offices. And so Kristol would have his morning office would be the Public Interest, and AEI would be his afternoon office. So, of course, he didn't know how to drive. So he would walk or cab from his apartment in the Watergate to his morning office, and then take the stroll from the morning office to the afternoon offices. And that was kind of the pattern of his life in Washington for many years.
Right. Yeah, since we began the conversation about Israel, I do remember that the current prime minister, Netanyahu, won the prize some years ago, right?
He did. And he went out of his way to talk about both Kristol and his wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, briefly in his opening remarks. The award goes to political figures, statesmen like Netanyahu. It goes to intellectuals, goes to journalists. Last year's awardee was Paul Gigot, the editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial pages. And they deliver lectures or have conversations. It's a good way to promote AEI's set of values by recognizing those values in major participants in our public life.
Now, I'd like to quote from a piece that Kristol wrote in the journal. That was in 1975. The piece was titled "On Conservatism and Capitalism." He concluded the piece by saying, "It was religion and the bourgeois ethos that used to cover this added dimension to capitalism. But religion is now ineffectual, and even businessmen find the bourgeois ethos embarrassingly old-fashioned. This leaves capitalism and its conservative defenders helpless before any moralistic assault, however unprincipled. And until conservatism can give its own moral and intellectual substance to its idea of liberty, the quote-unquote liberal subversion of our liberal institutions will proceed without hindrance, unquote. Yeah, so two things come to mind. One, how does Kristol connect the defense of capitalism to, well, the American conservative framework as a whole?
Sure. Well, so 1975, it was a pretty dismal year for the United States. We had just had Watergate and the resignation of President Nixon. We had this first unelected president in our history, Gerald Ford. Americans were extremely anti-institutional, very suspicious now of their government. We were in the midst of leaving Vietnam, South Vietnam, and the North taking over the entirety of the country. It was a pretty bleak time for the United States. And so I think this essay by Kristol's, one that he actually recommended for many years as kind of a key piece of his work, is slightly reflective of that. The market was under siege by regulators, by critics. And I think he was trying to figure out a way where defenders of market society and defenders of representative government could reassert themselves. And so he talks about so 1935, religion doesn't have the power it once had. The bourgeois ethos of, being steady and judicious and responsible and parsimonious, that wasn't really in high regard either. So he kind of seems to me to almost throw up his hands at the end of that column and say, I don't know, we have to figure out a way. Now, what's interesting is that we have the rise of the religious right later in that decade. And then I think Irving Kristol sees the religious right as a way of remoralizing American society, of injecting religious values back into our understanding of representative government and market society. And so he becomes a great defender of the religious right and religion in public life, because he believed that without a religious backing, market society would descend into hedonism and chaos. And that would only then weaken representative government as well. So carrying the argument forward to today, I think we're in a somewhat similar situation as Kristol was in 1975. This is a low point for America. People are pessimistic about the future. Religion is in decline in the United States. Certainly institutionalized religion is in decline. The bourgeois ethos is not a presence in our culture in any way. There are millions of Americans who still live by it. There's still millions of Americans who get married, have children, live in communities, but they don't vocalize it. It's very rare to see that form of life represented in the culture. So Kristol would say the same thing. If you want to defend market society, if you want to strengthen representative government, you need some backing to those arguments other than self-interest, other than the ideas that greed is good. And I think he would be in a similar place if he wrote that piece today, because he wouldn't know where that backing would come from. The good news we have is that in retrospect, we see that sometimes it does appear that there can be social and moral awakenings that infuse a society, that reinvigorate a society, that inspire confidence in the country again. And so we can only hope that something similar will happen in the future. I will say too, no one really anticipated the religious right, and the religious right began making its appearance in culture even before it became a mass political movement. There's a great interest in religiosity and spirituality in the later 1970s that then kind of manifested itself in institutions like the moral majority. So I would just keep an eye on that. You have to keep an eye on the culture before the politics. Right now, I think so many people, left and right, are focused almost entirely on the politics.
Yeah, which brings me to my second point in that there are a good number of the right, or there's a growing right movement that is against the idea of liberal capitalism itself. I remember last year, Sohrab Ahmari published a book titled Tyranny Incorporated: How Private Enterprise Crushed American Liberty. He used to write for Commentary, just to add. And people like, I think, J.D. Vance or Josh Hawley or Marco Rubio, elected officials, who are against, who are for what they call economic nationalism or economic populism, but in reality, it's just a repackaging of protectionism. So, how has the right lost its faith in the free market?
Sure. There are a few threads to disentangle here. I don't think we can say that the right has lost its faith in the free market. I think that what has happened is the Republican Party is now divided between essentially Republican conservatives who were there prior to the rise of Trump, and then post 2014, post Trump, new arrivals to the Republican Party. And these new arrivals are economic nationalists. They are people who are more protectionist in general. They are much more supportive of entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, and they are more generally inclined to think that government has a big role to play in the economy. So there's a split. I would say on one issue in particular, a consensus has been reached, and that is the issue of trade with China. I think the Republican Party as a whole is more inclined to the view that because China is a communist adversary of the United States, America needs to find ways of certainly reducing our trade with them on national security components, also thinking through other ways to have our trade relationship affect more broadly our political relationship and our ideological relationship with China. So that's one consensus. Otherwise, the trade question is really just, it's not even fought anymore. There's no real argument. And I think if there were an argument, there would be people who would say, well, with our allies, America should have certain reciprocal trade, a fair trade agreement, free trade agreements. So that trade is one thing. And then you have the welfare state is another thing. What's interesting about this new economic nationalism is, in truth, well, I think that Kristol would be kind of shocked at the rise of Trump and of the MAGA movement. Maybe not shocked, but a little bit worried about its effects on American democracy. He was always of the view that politics took priority over economics. And so if he was very skeptical of the application of kind of an economic rationalism to every part of American life, and including American government. So one thing that distinguished neoconservatives from other conservatives was that the neoconservatives, Irving Kristol, was friendly toward the welfare state. Especially, he thought that every society has a welfare state. Welfare state is not actually inimical to representative government. And he believed that conservatives should, instead of trying to abolish or destroy the welfare state, should try to shape it in a more conservative direction. And that actually meant not totally transforming Social Security or ending Social Security, as many earlier conservatives wanted to do, but strengthening it. So I'm not quite sure where he would fall if he were writing today on some of these questions of economic nationalism. He might say, well, the nationalists are responding to real problems, but they're doing so in the wrong way. But with any writer who is no longer with us, we can't really, say with any clarity what, where they would fall on these questions. But I would say the general attitude I would take is that Kristol did believe that politics was before economics. So he was never going to simply restate libertarian dogma as response to public policy issues. He believed that in market society, as I said, but he had a very clear-eyed view of human nature, and that sometimes people don't like the results of the market. Sometimes participants in market society are not good actors, and so he did think that there had to be both a defense of why the market mattered, but also an understanding that you needed to defend and strengthen the market through other means, mainly cultural, but sometimes, if you need to have a trade barrier with China, you might have to have a trade barrier with China.
Well, I'd like to end on this note. Kristol wrote an essay in the Public Interest in 1973 titled Capitalism, Socialism, and Nihilism. So I like to quote, the enemy of liberal capitalism today is not so much socialism as nihilism. Only liberal capitalism doesn't see nihilism as an enemy, but rather as just another splendid business opportunity. So I think 50 years or so has passed since Kristol wrote those words. To what extent has they been true?
Well, I think a lot depends on what nihilism means. The nihilism, I think he's taking it from the writings of Leo Strauss, the emigre German philosopher who influenced Kristol, whose students definitely influenced Kristol in their views on America and American constitutionalism. What I think I would take from that essay is the rise of moral relativism in the United States. And maybe where he uses nihilism, I would use moral relativism. And it has been a critique that conservatives and neoconservatives have made of American culture, that our culture has become relativistic, that Americans no longer have a shared understanding of a transcendent morality. Usually you get that from religion. And as religion's role in American life has waned, the idea of a transcendent standard of morality, an objective moral norm, has waned with it. And that has given rise to a more relativistic culture. If you're not hurting anybody else, then who's to say that your behavior should be judged wrong or abnormal? An idea that there's a value, the economy, that we don't need to have moral values injected into our economy. So if states want to run lotteries, and if we want to legalize gambling, electronic gambling throughout the country, well, who cares? Because who's to say that you shouldn't engage in that? And if there are, by the way, we'll put the phone number for the addicts hotline in every one. Now, what's interesting is that as moral relativism, I think, has suffused our society deeply, parts of our society and culture have become more morally adamant. So this is something that Alan Bloom, a student of Leo Strauss, who wrote the famous book, The Closing of the American Mind in 1987, he predicted that once you reach a certain point of relativism, then everything just becomes a matter of will. and certain moral tendencies will just simply assert themselves, right? So we have the woke, right? And the woke are morally assertive about their particular perspective, right? Their perspective emerges from the climate of relativism, but then it translates itself into an assertion of power. That is new, right? Hamas, look at the Hamas sympathizers, right? So that comes out of a climate of relativism where, you know, who are we to distinguish between Israel and Hamas, right? But then it becomes an assertion of power. No Zionists here, right? Israel shouldn't be a Jewish state. So that's the challenge now. We've kind of like moved, we're post-relativistic in a way. We're so relativistic, we're post-relativistic. And now we have to deal with these claims to, these assertions of will, these claims to power that are coming from ideologues, fanatics within our culture and society. So that's the next, I think that was the next development that Kristol may have anticipated in that very good essay from which you quote, but certainly it's the challenge that we face now.
Yeah. I finished reading Bloom's book a few weeks ago. It was just masterful. There's still many things in it are still relevant today.
Absolutely.
So we've went full circle. We started with Israel and we ended with Israel. Thank you very much once again, Matt Continetti, for joining the show.
Thank you.